There are some who say that the past is dead. It cannot hurt you, for it is buried and gone. Of course, we know the truth. Some things can't be buried deep enough. That is what our story is about tonight. It's a tale known as The Pursuit of Madness.
Lev Sokolov looked down at his bracelet, covered in dangling lucky charms. He focused on them, allowing the sound of the engine to fade away, while he fought to keep his mind clear. He would need it for the work he was about to do. Across from him, a man named John snickered. He told Lev that charms wouldn't help. He had been on 100 jobs, and the only piece of metal he ever saw save a man's life was a bullet. Lev did his best to ignore the man. John just smiled and leaned forward, whispering how nothing good would help men like them anyway. He felt his stomach tense up. Like them. They were nothing alike. At least, that's what Lev kept telling himself. He never worked with these men before. Part of him wondered what he was even doing there. He wasn't a mercenary. He was a soldier, a protector of his country, his people. Or at least, that's what he wanted to believe. Until the mission in Georgia. Officially, it never happened, of course. That mission was where his innocence died. He couldn't tell himself he was doing the right thing after it. Not because it was espionage. Not even because of the strange hostiles they had encountered, but because it was that mission that he realized he would aim and fire upon people without a second thought. He wasn't a hero. He was a pawn. He didn't even flinch when he saw his comrade get mauled by something he could barely describe. After that encounter, he took his first chance to retire from the army. Which is how he came to be with these men. His training didn't help with normal civilian life, so he started to take odd jobs from wealthy bastards who used fake names. He tried to take good jobs. Search and rescue, hostage extraction, things of that nature. Of course, he didn't always get jobs like that. That was why he kept the bracelet. Deep down, he hoped that maybe something more than the mortal body would see something good in him, something worth saving, something he wanted to see in himself, even when he didn't. And so, he, along with John, his brother Jim, and a man named Marquis, were on a boat, plowing into the Arctic Ocean. He'd never worked with them before. These men were most likely former soldiers like himself. In a way, he was envious of them. They didn't seem to be burdened by the kind of thoughts that he was. Each of them was armed with multiple firearms and blades. They looked ready and willing to kill. They looked like good soldiers. He, meanwhile, didn't even bring a gun at all. All he had was his basic tools and camping equipment. The job was a strange one. He was to accompany Professor Etzo Kori into the Arctic. The professor claimed that he had been studying several strange anomalies in the area. Earthquakes, water level fluctuations. But the most interesting thing was a research vessel had vanished. So there they were, riding in a small speedboat into the most miserable and cold place Lev could think of, other than his own mind, of course. With some of the most miserable people he could think of. Thankfully, Lev didn't have time to dwell on how questionable they all were, as Jim shouted that he could see something on the horizon. Everyone looked up and saw it. A ship stuck on top of a field of ice. Kiori was ecstatic and instructed them to pull the boat alongside the ice shelf. while he muttered to himself about finding it. John questioned why no one else would have been able to find the vessel, and Dietzo just laughed and explained that because college students would always go in the wrong direction, they assumed the ship must have been close to its original route, but obviously it was forced far, far off track by the disruptions. The shift in the water levels and the earthquakes easily carried it far off course onto a tabular iceberg. The professor suddenly looked at the men and then explained that a tabular iceberg meant a free-floating island made of ice. John just told Dietzo he could call it whatever he wanted, so long as his check didn't bounce. Marquis and Lev went to search the ship while Jim, John, and the professor started to get their gear off of their own speedboat. The two checked each room of the ship until finally they came to a door that had been barricaded. It took both of them putting their full weight into it, but they were able to force the door open and promptly started to gag. They found what was left of the crew, the body of a woman curled up in front of a small space heater. She was frozen solid, with a journal beside her. Lev picked it up and tried to read it. Each page was covered with the same few phrases over and over again. Frozen hell, pretty kitty, in the water, and find me. She must have gone completely mad. He felt an anger in him. He had questions for the professor, but first he had a request to fulfill. He reached down and tried to pick the poor woman's body up, but she was literally frozen to the spot. So he unclipped his brush axe and prepared himself to break her free, when Marquis stopped him. They looked at each other for a moment in silence, trying to comprehend the morbid and tragic scene they were actually seeing, and the reality of what they could do. Slowly, Lev lowered his axe. Marquis was about to say something, when suddenly they heard shouting and gunfire. They ran back outside and looked over the edge of the ship. Some yards away, towering over Jim and Professor Etzo, was a monster. A massive seal covered in gray and black spots, holding John in its mouth. There was blood everywhere, steaming and freezing while John's limbs thrashed wildly between the creature's teeth. Jim had started to shoot at the thing, but his pistol's bullets only appeared to make it more angry. From where he and Marquis were standing, it must have been well beyond 20 feet long. It bellowed at the men, even with its mouth full of John. Lev jumped over the side of the boat and tumbled forward, raising his axe as he stood in one swift motion. But the monster seemed to realize that it was now outnumbered, and even with its size, it turned and threw itself into the water, carrying John with it. Lev quickly made his way to the others. Jim was still standing there, pulling the trigger of his empty gun. He wouldn't even blink. He just stared at where the monster had been, and where a large splatter of freezing blood now was. Etzo turned to Lev and was about to say something, when Lev punched him in the jaw and knocked the old man to the ground. Etzo looked up unimpressed and spat with a sneer on his face, commenting how he expected better from an old Russian bear. Marquis managed to take the gun away from Jim and told everyone to calm down. Lev, however, continued to glare down at Etzo and hissed that he had to have been aware of all of this. He had to have been aware of the ship, its crew, and the fact that there were unusual circumstances that threatened life. Etzo shrugged as he got to his feet, and explained that it was true he suspected the ship was there, and that its crew was most likely dead, but he hardly had ever accounted for giant leopard seals. The professor thought about it for a moment, and commented how even the normal-sized ones live on the opposite side of the planet. Marquis had to hold Lev back, while he continued to spit accusations at the professor. He could have prevented all this. He could have sent help sooner. The professor just shook his head and claimed he barely had the resources to hire them, let alone fund a full rescue expedition. Marquis told Lev to drop the issue for now. They needed to focus on getting back over the water and back to the mainland. Of course, Jim screamed in panic at the very idea of going anywhere near the water again, and Professor Ezio cleared his throat, informing the group that they would not be leaving. Their objective wasn't the ship. The professor's goal was far more inland, most likely at the center of this large ice surface. Besides, the monster came out of the water. It would be elaborate self-destruction to go anywhere near it again, at least at the moment. Lev looked down at the bloody patch of ice where John used to be standing, and cursed under his breath. The group secured their speedboat, and then set out in the direction opposite of the shore. As they went, Lev looked up to the ship, where the body of that woman was still frozen in place, waiting for help to arrive. He cursed again, and walked along to keep up with everyone else. No one spoke as they moved. The quiet in its own way pounded in their ears. There was nothing to see, just blank, pale ice in every direction. Miserable gray clouds covered the sky, with not even so much as a breeze to stir the thin layer of snow on the ground. That was when Lev noticed something. Nothing was moving except for them. There was no sound, there were no landmarks. It was like he was walking through a photograph, as if time itself was frozen still. At first he hated it, but slowly thoughts crept into his mind. Was this place so bad? There was nothing to stimulate his senses, sure, but did he need them? What did he need to see? What threat would he need to be aware of if there was literally nothing happening anywhere? It was a mind-numbing thought, but after the months of mental pain he had endured, he welcomed the numbness. Professor Ezio yelled for the others' attention and pointed to a shape in the distance. It was a dark, vague mass on the horizon. In a way, it frightened Lev, not because he thought it was alive, but because it was so defiantly changed from the otherwise perfectly still landscape. He felt like it didn't belong there, or maybe it made him feel like he didn't belong there. He shook the strange thoughts out of his head and hurried to catch up with the rest of the group. As they got closer, they could see the shapes more clearly. It was a city, one made of massive buildings held up by giant columns. Most of it was caked in ice, and almost none of the buildings looked actually complete. Everything was in ruins, broken or toppled over. Ezio walked up to one of the frozen columns and muttered a strange word. Hyperborea. The professor looked to the others and congratulated them for helping make the discovery of the century. The group slowly moved in deeper to the city, while Ezio excitedly looked around for any sort of artifact or relic that could be carried. Lev felt uneasy, however. Everything about this place was wrong. Not for it being ruins, or even encased in ice. It was the proportions that were wrong. The people who lived here would have had to have been giants, dozens of feet tall at the very least. He wasn't sure how long the city had been there itself. He wasn't sure how long they had been in the city, but after what felt like hours, they found something that left the group stunned. A huge mosaic depicting a massive red horse-like creature trampling through the city, with small purple humans attempting to fight it off with spears while others held fire over their heads, and towering over it all was a hypnotic black circular sign. Lev felt sick. He had to turn away from it. There was a painful drumming sound echoing in his ears. He could feel himself shaking. After a moment, he managed to ask what it was. The professor looked at the wall and explained that he had seen something like it before. An old colleague of his from college had shown it to him after doing research in Germany. He called it the Black Sun icon, some obscure sign of pre-Christian European paganism. He explained it tied to some sort of king that would walk the earth when the sun turned black, and specifically, he would come to hold dominion over a portion of the world, holding court with carnage, mayhem, and havoc. But what it was doing there? He had no clue. He speculated that it was some great invader who attacked the city. The survivors of the attack must have made this mural to remember their fallen, or perhaps to warn of what had occurred. Lev honestly felt worse having heard the explanation, but he didn't want to push the matter. He walked away while the others took pictures of the mosaic. Stepping away from it had helped, and slowly the strange drumming sound stopped. There was a part of him that was starting to like these ruins. They were quiet. Of course, he would still be happy to just leave and never come back. Sadly, no sooner had he allowed himself to enjoy the quiet, he started to hear shouting again. He sighed and turned back to the group. When he rounded the corner, he saw Ezio and Marquis, along with Jim, cornered between two more of those giant seals. Jim was screaming and shooting wildly at them, which once again seemed to have no effect. So Lev once again unclipped his axe from his belt and braced himself to attack, hoping that perhaps the beast's rubbery hide could be cut, even if they were apparently too tough for a simple pistol to shoot through. The seal closest to Jim rose up, with its jaw open wide, when one of Jim's bullets managed to catch it just in the roof of the mouth. There was a small burst of blood, and then it toppled lifelessly forward, right on top of Jim. The other seal, seeing one of its own kind suddenly die, no longer wished to be aggressive. It quickly turned and flopped away into the shadows, while Marquis and Lev rushed to try and push the beast off of Jim. Ezio just watched on, but even with Marquis' help, the two of them simply were not enough to push the massive carcass. The professor pointed out how a normal leopard seal weighs easily just under 800 pounds. One that size would be probably closer to a ton. There was no way two men were going to move it. Lev turned and pointed his axe at Ezio and growled for him to shut up. Ezio just stepped back and pointed out that there was no use in being rude. Lev took a step forward, not sure exactly what he was considering doing to the professor, when suddenly he could hear something. Ezio and Marquis could hear it too. It was a distant bell. Marquis asked if the wind could be making something in the ruins ring, but Ezio muttered that there wasn't any wind. Seeing no real other option, and not being able to save Jim at this point, the three of them agreed to move forward and start following the sound of the bell. It led them to a building that towered over the rest, with a ring of ornate pillars holding up a massive square slab of marble to serve as a roof. The building didn't have any doors or gates to speak of, but rather a large square opening that the bell sound was clearly coming out from within. The professor looked at Lev and Marquis and gestured for them to lead the way. The dark insides of the building required them to use their flashlights. Even by the limited amount of light they could summon, there were strange symmetrical patterns that they could see on the walls and floor. It appeared as if it was made of some sort of marble, much like the roof had been, though, oddly, from inside, their lights could not reach the roof itself. The professor wondered aloud, how could such a massive structure be built by primitive life? Lev wondered why he assumed it was primitive, or even that it was anything he would recognize as life. The group walked until they came to a chamber with strange metal figures. They looked like giant bronze beetles, roughly the size of a pony. Each had long extended pincers, with a large round shape about the size of a basketball just above them. Ezio looked over one, muttering, "These almost looked like the Cyclops beetles of Ishnotep." He looked at Marquis and Lev and explained that was a really old pharaoh. Both the men just rolled their eyes. Marquis walked up to one and tapped it. It didn't sound hollow. Marquis was about to ask a question when suddenly the metal statue shook, The round shape opened, revealing a large eye. Marquis, on reflex, drew his pistol and shot, hitting the large orb. It made a strange, deep droning sound, and then fell over. In quick succession, the other beetles began to jerk and awake, turning their eyes toward the slain beetle. They all moved on Marquis in a strange, organized fashion. There was something oddly familiar about their steps to Lev. Marquis shot at the creatures, but his bullets bounced off their bodies harmlessly, while the professor ducked behind Lev as the beetles swarmed Marquis, and used their pincers to reduce him to a pile of neatly cut meat and gore. They then turned towards Lev. They formed two perfect filed columns. Aetzo whispered, asking why they weren't attacking. And all at once, Lev knew. The things he recognized about their movements. These were soldiers. Guards by the look of it. They were assessing if Lev and Aetzo were threats, like Marquis had been. He could only think of one idea, so Lev took a step forward and put both his hands over his head, shouting, "I surrender." The beetles stared at him, and then one stepped forward. But Lev realized it wasn't looking at him. It was looking at his bracelet. Lev slowly lowered his hand, bringing the bracelet closer to the creature's eyes. It gently used its pincers to move some of the various charms around. Then the beetle stepped back and made a soft sound like a gong. Lev could only shrug, as the creature stepped back into its ranks with the others, and they all turned in perfect synchronization and started marching down a hallway. One looked back at them and made another long, gonging sound. Lev nodded and waved to Aetzo to follow. The bells were louder as they walked deeper into the building. The metal beetles started to glow softly, allowing the men to see without their flashlights. Neither of them dared to speak, not wanting to risk the possibility of offending their new hosts. When they finally came to a wall, the beetles stopped and stepped aside into two neat rows. The wall slowly opened, revealing a huge new chamber where the bell sounds were coming from. Lev pointed into the room, and one of the beetles shook its body up and down in an odd nodding motion. Seeing no other choice, the two men walked into the room, with Ezio, of course, standing behind Lev. The new chamber was massive like the rest of the building, but this one was well lit by giant bowls filled with fire. Pale white smoke rose up from the flames, smelling oddly fragrant. Lev was curious about these giant burners when Aetzo grabbed his arm. Lev turned to him and saw the professor was staring up at something with his mouth hanging open. Lev followed his gaze and then saw it. A beautiful, if disturbing, figure. It took up most of the already massive chamber. A humanoid shape draped in silk-like scarves and ribbons, kneeling down as if in prayer or meditation, with its hands resting on its lap. Its head was feline, with two large feathered wings coming out from its back, covered in a dark brown fur with odd shells that formed patterns going down its whole body. Lev shuddered at how it seemed so alien, and yet somehow familiar. Its size alone was like nothing he had ever seen before, but he felt as if he did somehow recognize it. The creature's eyes opened, and it looked down at them for a moment. For some reason that Lev didn't fully know at the time, he introduced himself, saying his name to the creature. It didn't react at first, but after a moment its mouth opened slightly and produced a bone-shaking sound. Both men fell to their knees, covering their ears. Lev felt like his skull was about to shatter, but amongst the pain, he could clearly make out syllables forming a single word. Ulkiza. With that, the creature closed its eyes again, returning to whatever strange prayer or meditation it had been doing before they disturbed it. The two men pulled themselves back to their feet. Aetzo was beside himself with excitement. telling Lev how they needed to return to the mainland for supplies and a much larger expedition. The professor turned back towards the entrance, but Lev didn't respond. Come back here? With more people? For what? To study this place? To chip and break it apart to write down notes for some petty journal? To claim this history like a victory for themselves? To pollute this holy place with their filthy, grubby fingers? Ulkiza could have splattered them against the wall, but not for wanting to spoil its decorations. Lev unclipped his axe from his belt, and in one swift motion buried the blade deep into Professor Aetso's skull, allowing the man to fall to the ground convulsing. He then pulled the axe out, wiped it off clean on his pant leg before clipping it back onto his belt. He turned and apologized for the mess before bowing his head to Ulkiza. It didn't respond, so Lev thanked it for sparing him, and then grabbed Aetso's body and dragged his corpse out of the room. In November of 2023, Professor Aetso Kori hired 4 privately contracted guards to escort him into the Arctic Ocean for research. The 4 men were never seen again. However, Professor Aetso was found 7 months later aboard a derelict ship that had crashed into the beach of Greenland, along with the body of an unidentified woman. Both bodies had been naturally mummified by exposure to the elements and cold. Around the same time, ghost stories spread of a strange masked figure in white that lurked around the rural countryside of Russia. This figure became known as the Pale Monk.
So next, it's autumn, Convenient.